Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ask Billings Farm Live. So as you know, Billings Farm Museum is closed for the time being, and we really miss having our visitors here with us on site. But we're so excited to be able to have the opportunity to connect with you virtually and digitally through these online platforms like these live videos and all of our digital content. So welcome, and today, as you can see, we are going to talk a little bit about pollinators and what makes them so special. So you might be asking yourself, what exactly is a pollinator? Well, a pollinator is an insect or an animal that moves pollen from one flower to another so that the flower and the plant can reproduce. And flowers and plants tend to reproduce through seeds and through fruit. So pollinators help to help those plants reproduce by transferring the pollen from one flower to another. So you can see here in this image, there's a bee who's covered in pollen. That's what all the yellow stuff is on its back. And pollinators usually do this on accident. They are traveling from flower to flower, maybe to feed on the nectar or the pollen, and it sticks to them. And when they go to the next flower, that's when it falls off. So which animals and insects are pollinators? There's a lot of different pollinators. So bees, like I mentioned before, insects like beetles and ants, butterflies and moths, even some animals like bats and mice can be pollinators as well. And like I said, a lot of them feed on nectar or pollen, so that's why they're on the plants collecting the pollen, and then as it falls off, that's when they pollinate. So why do we care? Why are pollinators important? Well, over 80% of the flowering plants in the world rely on pollinators in order to reproduce. And a lot of our favorite foods rely on pollinator in order to grow. So things like berries and apples and squash, coffee and tea. And then in the middle, those are actually vanilla beans. So both vanilla and chocolate both rely on pollinators in order to grow, which is very important to a lot of us, I know. In addition to all of the delicious foods that our pollinators help us to grow, they also help us to grow our wildflowers and our flowering plants. So the crops that pollinators help us to grow are worth about $10 billion per year in the United States. And the wildflowers are really, I would say, priceless. Flowering plants are such an important part of our environment. They help purify our water, they help us to prevent erosion, and they help to reduce carbon dioxide levels in the environment. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our most important and our best pollinators. And as I go, make sure that you leave any comments or questions below, and I'll make sure to answer them. So let's start by talking about my favorite pollinator, and the pollinator that is by far the most important and efficient, and that's the bee. So this is a bumblebee, and you can see that it has pollen stuck to the little hairs on its body. So bees actually collect pollen and feed on nectar, which makes them awesome pollinators, and their bodies are basically designed to collect this pollen. So you can see the pollen on the little hairs on the back of the bee, and what you can't see is that on the bee's forearm, there are little things almost like a comb, and what the bee can do is comb the pollen off of the hairs on its body into what are called the pollen baskets or pollen sacs that you can see on the back legs there. So some bees have this kind of feature of their body that help them to collect pollen that they can then bring back to their nests. So it's been said that bees are responsible for 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat, which is just incredible. Bees eat the nectar to give them energy, and like I said, they collect the pollen to eat and also to feed their young. And often when we think of bees, we think of honeybees, which are great pollinators, but honeybees are actually not native to North America. Here in North America, there are about 5,000 native species of bees, and those include bees like carpenter bees or blue orchard mason bees, all sorts of mason bees, squash bees, bumblebees like we saw in the other slide. And these native bees are so important to our ecosystem. They are actually 2 to 3 times better at pollinating than honeybees. And a lot of them pollinate specific flowers and plants. So you can see in the lower corner here, there are squash bees. And these guys are they specifically pollinate squash plants. So all of our pumpkins and our squashes, we owe to these pollinators here. A lot of them tend to nest in the ground, and they either nest in colonies or in solitary nests. And maybe you thought to yourself, well, what's the difference between a bee and a wasp? Well, wasps are pollinators too, but they're actually not as effective pollinators as bees. So they have smooth bodies, which make them less efficient at pollinating. You know, bees have these hairy bodies that gets the pollen to stick to them, but you can see here that the wasps have a smoother body that the pollen just doesn't stick to quite as easily. And wasps are also predators, which means that they will eat other insects, which actually makes them good to have around your garden because they can eat some of the pests that live on your vegetables and flowers. And then we don't have to use as many insecticides and pesticides, which helps our native pollinators and our pollinators out. One way that you can tell the difference between a wasp and a bee is you can look at their waist. So wasps have these little itty bitty narrow waists that almost look like an ant's waist. If you've ever looked at an ant's body, you know that they have kind of like a very thin waist, and wasps have something similar. And there's over 100,000 different species of wasps. So when we talk about wasps, we're also talking about yellow jackets and hornets. Those all fall under the larger category of wasps. So that's bees and wasps. Another really important pollinator is actually flies. So when you think of flies, you might think of the black house flies that we see buzzing around, which are pollinators, but most of the heavy lifting by fly pollinators is actually done by type of flies called hoverflies. And a lot of these flies actually look kind of like bees, and that's on purpose. So a lot of animals know bees have stingers. I know that, you probably know that too. So when you see a bee, maybe you're a little bit more careful around them because you think, well, you know, they might sting me. So these flies have actually evolved to look like bees so that other animals know that or think that they're bees and maybe stay back from them because they think that they might have stingers. Another thing that's very important to me is chocolate. One of my favorite foods is pollinated by tiny little flies called midges. So there's actually a midge in the upper right-hand corner here. So they're the only pollinator that's small enough to get into the intricate flower of the chocolate or the cocoa plant. So thank you, midges, for my favorite food. Now you might be surprised to learn that butterflies and moths are generally not considered major pollinators, especially of vegetables and things around the garden. But they certainly are pollinators, and they certainly do a good job, especially of pollinating our flowering plants. So the reason that they're not as effective pollinators as some of the other insects we've discussed is because of the way that they sit on the flower and feed. So you can see in this image that the butterfly is sitting on the edge of the flower and reaching its really long tongue into the flower. And because of that, they don't get as much they don't get as much pollen on their bodies, which will then fall off when they go to the next flower. So these are some of the native butterflies that we've seen around Billings Farm and Museum. It's just really cool to see all of the varieties. I believe it's a swallowtail, I think a painted lady, and a monarch. And monarchs are a very important part of our ecosystem that have been getting a lot of attention lately because their numbers have really been declining. So it's great to see them around. Moths are very similar to butterflies, but they're actually considered to be more effective pollinators. That's because they have scaly wings and bodies that the pollen can stick to a little bit easier. And they also are more active at night. So they do a really good job of pollinating all of the night blooming flowers that we have. So other pollinators kind of take the day shift, and then moths can take the night shift. So I'm seeing a question about, do we have squash bees in Vermont? And we certainly do have squash bees in Vermont. And if you visit a pumpkin patch when the vines are out and the flowers are out, you are pretty sure to see a good amount of squash bees out there in the squash flowers. So the last pollinators that I'm going to talk about today are animals. And you might not think of animals when you think about pollinators, but there are several animals that are really great pollinators, especially hummingbirds. So if you've ever seen a hummingbird, they're really tiny, and they beat their wings really quickly so that they almost look like they hover in the air. And they have really high metabolisms. So in order to keep up their energy, they need to drink a lot of nectar, which is basically like sugar water. It's really high in energy. So hummingbirds actually drink about 2 times their body weight in nectar every day. And that's just what they need to help them keep going. So you can see here how the hummingbirds, they feed on the flowers. And as they do that, again, the pollen gets stuck to them. And as they go from flower to flower, they help us to pollinate. So this is a ruby-throated hummingbird. They are the most common hummingbird here in Vermont, but we also have had the rufous hummingbird. There's been definitely sightings of the rufous hummingbird here as well, although it is much more unusual. And then you may have heard that bats are good pollinators too. And that's absolutely true. Bats are very important pollinators, but not really here in Vermont. In desert areas and in tropical areas, bats are really important pollinators of plants like cactuses. But up here in Vermont, the bats aren't really pollinating a lot of the plants here, but still certainly very important pollinators who deserve a mention. And I love this picture because it shows this little bat with all of the pollen on its face as it's feeding on the flowers. I just think it's awesome. So what can we do in our homes and in our gardens to help pollinators? You know, we talked about how important they are, how much we rely on them, all of the food that we get from pollinators. How can we help them out, right? So pollinators need a couple of different things, like most insects and most animals, right? They need food, they need water, and they need habitat. So the food that they get comes from flowers and the nectar and the pollen mostly. So one of the things that we can do to help pollinators is to plant things that are good food and forage for them. So we're really lucky to have a special guest here. Ben Pauley is the master gardener at the Woodstock Inn's Kelly Way Gardens, and he's going to talk with us a little bit about the things that they do and plant to help support pollinators.
Hello everybody, I'm Benjamin Pauley at the Woodstock Inn Resort, and I just wanted to share with you a couple thoughts I had on bees and plants and flowers and pollination for Billings Farm Pollination Week. So right now we're at Kelly Way Gardens, which is the inn's market garden that grows vegetables and flowers and herbs and fruits. And then we also have a couple acres at Billings Farm Museum that we manage, and we grow some fun things out there, which I'll talk about at the end. But first I want to talk to you about bees. And so there are thousands of types of bees, and Vermont alone has almost 300 species of bees. And while we do have honeybees in the garden, they're not native to Vermont. So I really want you to get interested in native pollinators. So there's tons of bees. There's mason bees, there's bumblebees, everybody knows bumblebees, carpenter bees, and so all these bees are part of the ecosystem already. So to plant plants that attract these bees and to provide areas for them to nest is crucial for pollination of the garden. You would be surprised that some plants are specifically pollinated by native bees and not honeybees. So if you're growing squashes and pumpkins, those are all native bees. Tomatoes are typically native bees, blueberries, strawberries. So if you love these things, which I'm sure you do, you really want to encourage native bees in your garden. And so one of the sources that I look to is the Xerces Societies, and they actually put out this great book, Attracting Native Pollinators, and it kind of goes through the pollinators that they kind of highlight and what's their habitat, what do they need to feed on, and you want to, and then they also talk about plants, what plants you can plant to attract those pollinators and how to arrange it in your garden. I'm kind of standing in front of one little strip right here between our kind of road going through the garden and our bed's going up on this side. And this is a little steep for doing cultivation beds, so there's lots of little pockets in the garden that you can plant plants just to attract beneficial insects and those native pollinators. So this whole row has daffodils coming in right now, which are gorgeous and used for cut flowers. Probably not a great pollinator plant, but right now in the spring, that's what you're seeing. And I'm standing in a patch of New England asters. Right behind that is rose milkweed. And then we have something called Liatris ligulostylus, which I'll talk about in a second. And they're in blocks, so it's good to plant these plants in, this is about a 4x4 or 6x6 block. It's easier for the bees to find. They can kind of hone in on that specific plant. And it's good to really plant things that straddle the season. So again, the New England asters are fantastic. They're in the fall. They're blooming around frost. One of the last things to bloom. Bees love them. We also have all throughout the outside of the garden pussy willows. I have a little kind of wet spot over there, so we've planted a bunch of pussy willows. Those are one of the first things that bloom in the spring that the bees just gravitate towards. And so there is one plant in particular that I want you to get excited about. They're not for bees particularly, but it's more for monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are kind of the poster child of pollination, and they aren't really pollinating much in the garden for vegetables, but they definitely pollinate wildflowers. And so I wrote it down that Liatris ligulostylus is called meadow blazing star. I just want you to write it down because there are many species of Liatris out there. You'll find them at garden centers, but you want specifically Liatris ligulostylus. The other ones will attract monarch butterflies, but this one just blows them out of the water. I have a patch kind of behind that light. It's about 6 feet by 6 feet. I probably have about 12 to 15 plants in there. It is not uncommon in August, when that is blooming, to find 20 to 30 monarchs just wafting in the wind all around them. So it's absolutely fantastic. It'll blow your mind out. Plant that, plant the rose milkweed. You have perfect habitat for the butterflies, adult butterflies to feed, and then their larvae to feed on the milkweed. And lastly, sunflowers. So sunflowers, we do lots of different things at sunflowers, but our highlight is at Billings Farm Museum, and we do the sunflower house. This year, it's about half an acre, 3/4 acre patch of land that we plant sunflowers. And this year we have over 50 varieties of sunflowers, and it's there are pathways, alleyways, hallways, big round rooms, sunflowers that get 18 inches tall, and ones that get 14 feet tall. So they're quite fun. And again, 50 different varieties this year. Walking through, you'll see every color of yellow you can imagine. And we look forward to having you come and visit us this fall at Billings Farm and enjoy Pollination Week.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was great information. And I definitely encourage you to check out what they do at Kelly Way Gardens. It's just incredible. So when they open back up, definitely put that on your list because they do some really awesome and beautiful things up there. So Ben mentioned some of the things that they grow, and we'll definitely put the information on some of the plants down in the comments below. And so you can see those and see them written out as well. So some of the other things that you can do to support your pollinators are you can make them a bee bath. So this is a bee bath that I actually made, and you can see a video of how I made it up on our website. But basically a bee bath is super easy to make. It's just a shallow dish. This one is blue, which bees love and are attracted to. And it's just a shallow dish with some rocks in that bees can sit on and have a safe place to drink. So it's not something that they're going to fall into and drown. It's just a safe, nice, clean source of water for them. And then the last thing that pollinators need is habitat. So you can see here, this is our bee house. And it has a lot of different mediums in there for native bees who are solitary bees and nest generally in wood. So you can see there's some paper straws, there's some blocks of wood that have holes drilled into them, and there's some sticks in there. And what the native bees will do is they'll go in there, lay their eggs, and then close the holes up. So you can actually see whether or not the bees are using their bee hotel or bee house. And I was there a little while ago, and I actually did see some of the holes were plugged up. So our bee hotel is going very well. But other than that, a lot of native bees do tend to nest in the ground. So if there's an area of your yard or your garden that you can just leave undisturbed and not a place where people aren't walking and kind of trampling the ground, and you can leave that as native bee habitat, that's really helpful to get these bees a safe habitat. And then one of the last things that we can do to help our pollinators is to cut back our use of pesticides and insecticides. That will help keep our pollinators alive and happy. So if anyone has any more questions, make sure you leave them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer them. And if we don't get to them in this video, we will definitely hop on and answer them afterwards. So thanks again for joining us. Just a couple of things that are coming up that I wanted to make you aware of. This week is our pollinator week, so check back for a lot of really great pollinator content. If you love pollinators as much as me, this week is really exciting, and each day we're posting a new pollinator cocktail and mocktail. So these are drinks that are that have ingredients that rely on pollinators. So you can have yourself a little pollinator happy hour every day, along with a lot of other great content that you can find on our website and on Facebook. And then a couple of other things that we have coming up. Next week is our draft animal week. So this weekend would have been our draft animal event, which is a great event that we usually love welcoming visitors for. And so this year we are moving it online. So every day you can see and learn about draft animals on our farm and on other farms. And I've heard that we're going to get an update on Mr. Huck, who you might know from Huck's Way Home, our children's book. He's doing really well, and we're going to have a little update on how he's doing. And then the last week of May, so May 25th through 29th, is our sheep shearing and herding week. Again, that's a virtual version of one of our favorite events, and we're doing a really cool sheep to scarf demonstration throughout the week. So you can see how wool goes from the sheep through all of the different processes into a scarf, and you can see the final product. So those are some things that we're excited about coming up. Also in 2 weeks, on May 20th at 1 p.m., we are going to do our next Ask Billings Farm Live, and we would love to see you all there. And this one is actually going to be live from our garden, so you can see how things are growing and ask us any questions about our gardens, about your garden at home, any questions you might have about that. So we're really excited to host our next Ask Billings Farm Live also. So thanks again so much for joining us. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them below, and we will certainly answer them. And then we will see you again next time. Thanks again.